Hey everybody, it's Author MD New. Welcome back to my writing tips and tricks for authors. So today we are doing a follow-up on the video that I just released earlier about the 10 best ways to start your novel. So today we are going to be chatting about the 10 worst ways to start a novel. Now again, keep in mind that these are just suggestions, and for every rule that we lay out today, there is going to be an exception to that rule. So just keep that in mind. Again, these are just suggestions. These are what have been passed along and all the professionals and all the experts say. So I'm going to give you my take on it. I'm going to share my experience with it. And we're going to go over the 10 worst ways to start a novel. But before I do that, I hope that you will all please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. I really do appreciate it. It really does make a big difference, and it does help me out quite a bit. And it just lets me know that there are people out there interested in this topic and interested in getting these writing tips and tricks. Writing is a lonely journey, and the more we can share and the more we get this information out there, I think it's the better off we all will be. Let's dive into my 10 writing tips and tricks for the worst ways to start your novel. First up, the first worst way to start your book is by telling the story. An example of this is what we're all familiar with, Once Upon a Time. Right? We don't need to know Once Upon a Time. It's a cliche. Now, it works great for kids' books, and that's fine, but if you're not writing a children's book, you need to be a little bit more creative. Don't sit there and tell the story. Involve all of your senses, involve all the characters' senses. Hit the reader with what they might be smelling, with what they're seeing, with what they're feeling, with what they're touching, with what they're sensing, etc. The bigger the picture you paint for the reader, the better off the story will begin. So that's kind of the first one. It's pretty self-explanatory. So diving into number 2, backstory, or the proverbial info dump. Right? You do not want to spend the first chapter, the first 3 chapters, or the first 4 chapters doing all this world building and dumping on the reader all this information that they may or may not care about. I'm not saying that you have to dive into the action, but you should really think about starting the story with the character, with the main character. That way the reader gets to know who the protagonist is. If you want to start with the antagonist, that's fine too. But that way they get a feel for who the characters are, and let the world building or let the backstory flow naturally from there. It will all come out. Just let it take its time and happen organically. So that was my tip number 2 for the worst ways to start your book, is the awful, hideous info dump. And trust me, we all do it. I've done it. I know all my fellow authors have done it. So just keep that in mind when you're starting your story. Number 3. This ties into tip number 2, and it goes into the whole world building. We, as readers, don't need all this information that us writers want to do. We think it's all interesting and fascinating and exciting because we spent all this time in this world, and we want to get it all from here out onto the page and share it with the world and have everybody as excited as we are. That's not how it works. The reader, sure, they want a certain amount of world building. They want to know where the character is, what the character is doing, what the character is like, but they don't need all that detail. For one of my novels, Contact, it's actually in my New World series, I have probably 100 pages of notes on the world that I've crafted for this series. Most of that information is stuff that, yeah, I would love for the readers to actually someday read, but the reality is they don't need it. It's there for me, so as I'm writing the story, I can tell the story, and I have the information I need to tell that story. So, when you're starting off your book, don't do all the world building at once, because like I said, it does fall into the info dump zone, and we want to avoid that at all costs. We want to make the story as engaging and exciting and as wonderful for the reader as possible. The next tip I have to avoid when starting your first novel or starting your novel is having the main character gaze into a mirror or a reflective surface and then talking about their appearance, how maybe they don't like the wrinkles on their face or the color of their eyes or the way their lips are too thin or whatever it is. The reason why we don't want to start our books this way is because it is cliche. It has been done numerous times, and it will probably still continue to be done numerous times. But it's not very interesting, and it's a really kind of a cheating way to give the reader kind of that character description so they know what the character looks like. Now, in full disclosure, I did start one of my books off kind of this way. She was actually looking out a window at her fleet of ships, and she caught hints of her reflection. And I didn't really comment on the way she looked, but it was kind of there, and it was something that I worked with the editor on, so we kind of took out the descriptions that I threw of her that she noticed about herself and kept it more focused on what was happening around her. But I was able to, because I had her looking in a reflection, when the door opened behind her, she saw another character who was a main character walk into the room, and she was able to kind of describe him, and it just worked out really well. The editor was happy, my publisher was happy, and I was happy. So there are ways around it, but if you're going to start off with the character looking into a mirror or gazing out at a reflective surface, be warned. This is cliche, and chances are you might get dinged for it. Okay, tip number 5 is starting your book in a point of view that is not one of your main characters. So this happens when you start the book from a character who really isn't part of the story, or they might be part of the story but later on. Or worse, they're just a nobody character who are setting the stage. Now, this might work in a Greek tragedy or a Greek play, but in a book, not so much. So you really don't want to have the story starting in a point of view character that doesn't necessarily isn't a main character who we're going to be following in the story. However, now that I just said this, here's the big caveat. If you are going to start your story in the point of view of a character that isn't really a main character, but the information is necessary, do it in the prologue. Don't make the prologue huge, a couple pages maybe, but you can pull all that information that you need to pull and give it to the reader in the prologue. So it could just be a character's point of view who you need to kind of set the stage. Do this in the prologue, keep it nice, short, sweet, and tight, and then chapter 1, start with the main character and go from there. That way the reader's got the information they need, and you feel good about how you're starting the story, and you can move on to the story and go from there. So keep that in mind. For tip number 5, you do not want to start your story in the point of view of a character that's not your main character. Number 6. Now this one's a tough one because depending on the kind of story you're writing, you may need to do this, but it's something to watch and to be very careful of, is introducing too many characters at once. When you're writing the story and starting off your story, you don't want to bombard the reader with all these names, right? You don't want to have them sitting there and reading about all these different characters all at once. It's confusing. And it can be really hard for them to get into the story if they're getting constantly thrown with names. I mean, they've just started the book, so they're maybe 2 or 3 pages in, and if you're already throwing like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 names at them, they're going to be so confused. And they may put your book down. which that would be a bad thing. So you don't want to do that. Keep it tight, keep it simple. 1 character, 2 characters, 3 characters, 4 characters, maybe, depending on how you do it. Why this is important is because when you're doing this introduction of the characters, especially if you're throwing names at people that aren't necessarily common names that people are going to be familiar with, if they're names because they're all elves or aliens or demons or angels or whatever, the person who's reading it, that's a new name for them. They've never heard this name before. They might not have heard this name before. So, they're going to have to try and remember that, and then they might have to flip back and forth going, now, who is this person? Wait, what? How? What? You don't want to do that. You want to kind of make it as easy for them as possible. That said, I know I've broken this rule a couple of times, and in my upcoming novel, I will probably be breaking this rule as well, just because the nature of how the story begins. I think I introduced 4 or 5 characters in the first chapter, and there is no way around it as of yet. That might change working with my editor, who knows. So, but I'm aware of it. So keep that in mind as you're starting your story. Next up, now I've seen this done really well, and I actually don't have a problem with stories starting this way, but I know why you're not supposed to start a story this way. So tip number 7 for the worst ways to start a story is starting with a dream. Now, I say that I've seen this done well because I have. The reason being is because it's a reoccurring theme in the book. What you don't want to do, or you want to try to avoid, is having your character waking up dazed or confused, or they open their eyes, or maybe they've have amnesia and they just woke up and they don't know who they are, where they are, what's going on. It's a cliche, and it's been done. Now, it has been done really well, and it continues to be done really well. I've read some wonderful stories where this has happened. So I actually don't mind it from a reader's standpoint. However, I can see how it can be challenging from a writing standpoint. And again, in full disclosure, I've done it. I've had a character who had a vision starting at the very beginning of the book. That's kind of how they were introduced. And it was like, okay. But it was part of the theme of the story, them having visions, so it worked. I also introduced another character with them waking up in the morning after having an interesting dream. Now, this was not the very first chapter of the book, but this was the introduction to this character. So we can do it. It does work. It's just something to think about and be conscious of when you're writing your story. If there's another way to do this, then do it. But if there's not, then really find a way to make it as interesting and as short and as sweet and as succinct as possible. So that was tip number 7, having them waking up, right? So tip number 8, for the worst ways to start a book, is having the first sentence, first paragraph, or first couple of paragraphs over the top. Meaning you're trying to do too much. You want to start with a bang, and you're determined to make that first sentence and that first paragraph as powerful as you can, and you're doing all of this great writing, and you're so excited, and it feels forced. And you might be using too many big terms, or you might be throwing in too many characters, or you might be doing too much world building, or this might be an info dump. Don't go over the top with your first sentence or your first paragraph. Make it interesting, make it unique, make it different, make it something the reader wants to continue, but just don't go crazy with it. Also, don't worry about it. You're going to go back and edit it, right? So, as I mentioned in the last video, editing. This first sentence, this first paragraph, may not even be the first sentence or the first paragraph when you get done. It might be somewhere else in the book. So, keep that in mind. You don't want to go over the top. You don't want to go crazy with the first sentence, first paragraph of your book. Next up, I touched on this before, and it falls into the whole dream category, but I want to call this out specifically. Having your main character waking up. They wake up, the sun is shining through the windows, the light hits their face, they're warm, they roll over, they open their eyes, they see their clock or their phone, and they start their day. Blah, blah, blah. Boring, boring, boring. Cliche, cliche, cliche. Now, again, this has been done well, and I'm guilty of doing it. I don't know if I've done it well, but I am guilty of doing it. So, keep that in mind if you're starting the book with them waking up. It's not one of the best ways to do this. One, you can skip all the waking up and just have them start with their morning routine. Or starting the story as they're starting their day, right? Have them pulling up in the parking spot to where they work, or going for a run, right? Or having breakfast. Well, it's kind of the same type of thing. But, don't have them just waking up and, new day, right? No, don't do that. Try to avoid it. Come up with a better way of starting that section of the book or the book itself. That was number 9. So number 9 is kind of that whole waking up cliche. Number 10, and this is the big one, is beginning in the middle of the story. Now, this is number 10, and this is the last point, but it's one of the most important points. You do not want to start your story in the middle. You want to start your story at the beginning, whatever that beginning is. So, let me give you what this means. The book starts after the inciting incident. The inciting incident is an event that occurs in relation to your protagonist near the beginning of your story, which sets the story moving in a different direction. So, what that means is you could have the characters starting off their day or whatever, but then halfway through the first chapter, something happens that completely changes what's going on. Some really good examples of this, and I don't even need to tell you the names of the stories, but you're going to know them immediately, is Harry being told that he's a wizard, right? That was the inciting incident for the whole novel and for the whole series. Lucy finding the passage to Narnia. Again, we got a lot of information about Lucy and her brothers and sisters before the story, but the story really started when she found that passageway to Narnia. So, you also have when Katniss volunteers for the Hunger Games, right? Again, we got some information before that part of the story. We had some character building, we had some world building, we knew about what was going on, and then we all of a sudden, have Katniss, who we started to care about a little bit, volunteering for the Hunger Games, and we know that there's going to be no good coming from that. The other one, the last example I have, is when Nick meets Gatsby at the house party. We got introduced to Nick, got to know a little bit about the world, but the story didn't actually begin until he and Gatsby met at the house party. So those kind of are the inciting incidents for those stories, and even for those series. So, everybody, these were my 10 worst ways to start a novel, with some ways to work around them, and some contradictions of even what worst means. So I hope that this helps. I hope that you found this video informative. As always, please like and subscribe. I really do appreciate it. Share this information out there with other authors who you may know, who might also find it helpful. Otherwise, I've been author MD New. Have a great day, and we'll see you again real soon. Take care, everybody. Bye.